light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. With me today on the show, I have my friend Sally Vanderford. And as an interfaith minister, I often get in conversations about suicide because it is such a widespread problem throughout human society, even all around the world. There are a variety of causes, a variety of ways to understand it, but what we're hoping for in the next half hour is kind of a brainstorming session of ways to understand it and also ways to respond to it.
Exactly.
Sometimes prevention, sometimes afterward. We can't prevent all of them because there are individuals who are so overrun with problems that it's not any one person's fault, but it's still a tragedy that we would like to prevent whenever we can.
You know, the older the person attempting suicide, the more likely they are to be successful.
That's true, I suppose.
Yes.
I mean, it would make sense because they would know more about what is successful and what is not. It's not just that they're attempting, it's that they're making a choice.
And perhaps more determined.
More determined in some ways. One of the perhaps obvious or most logical instances that comes to my mind would be someone with a terminal illness.
Yes.
You know, when they simply don't want to
Go through that.
hang on to life to that last little drop where there is no quality left.
Right.
There are at least one or two countries around the world now that I understand allow for euthanasia.
I believe there's one state.
One
And I
state?
cannot name it, but I believe there is one state that has a path to use.
Pretty sure that, if I recall reading, and I hope I'm not misquoting this, but I thought someone had told me that you can now, under very, very specific circumstances, you can now choose euthanasia in the Netherlands. But it's things like terminal illness and also, I mean, there's a number of different criteria. This is not something done lightly.
Twice now I have had people very close to me near death, and the nurses let me know that they could give an overdose of morphine. When the family was ready, we told them, okay, let's go ahead and give them a shot. So it happens. Euthanasia happens.
Okay, but is that something that's totally off the record when they say that?
Yes.
You know, and the
Yes.
nurse is basically taking a very big risk at that point that they won't be reported. At one point in time, it seemed to me as I was contemplating this that being suicidal is kind of a place of radical disempowerment.
Definitely.
Where you think there is nothing that can be done except suicide to make the pain stop.
Exactly.
And that's where I would place a bit of responsibility on society to say, we need to be there for each other. No one should ever be thrust into circumstances where they have no answer.
And that's why I feel I've got at least a bit of expertise in this field, because I was the lady at the other end of the 911 line.
Okay.
And I would get people calling me up saying, I'm going to kill myself.
But in your case, you have a minute and a half to respond to the situation. It's not, you know, in my case, where I've dealt with it, I usually have much more time than that.
I can stay on the phone I could have stayed on the phone with any caller as long as I needed.
Yes.
It could have been 15 minutes.
But if you didn't make headway in the first minute and a half...
If it was a medical call, if some attempt had already been made,
okay,
that's where I was under the time constraint to get that call out.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Because now we've got someone
was already bleeding or something.
Yes.
Okay.
What I would say when I'd get that call, first thing I'd say is, it sounds like you're having a really bad day. Mm-hmm. We've shortened it down to just today, not
It's not a bad life, it's a bad day.
We're having a bad day, and guess what? We can deal with a bad day. And then I would explain very.
But
go
that's
ahead.
that's where I want people to notice what you just said. We can deal with a bad day. It's not that you can deal with a bad day. We can.
Right.
I'm here for you. We can deal with a bad day.
And I would be completely honest with them about what was about to happen. I could
And
tell
very
them
often the person feels like they have no one else. And so you're their last human
that's
contact.
why they're contacting me.
Yeah, they want another human being.
I would let them know, okay, some officers are going to show up. They're going to ask you some questions. They very well might take you down to a place called emergency psychiatric where a doctor is going to ask you some questions. You may be put on a 3-day hold, a 10-day hold, depending on how severe this is. But I want you to know that that hole that you're in and you can't even see the top of the hole, I can help you climb out of that hole.
It's extremely difficult in such moments to see the options.
It is.
But it's not, in 99% of the cases, it's not that there are no options. It's just that from where you're standing,
They're
they
not
may be
visible.
invisible.
Yeah.
They're around the corner or behind the curtain or someplace. But
Or
guess what?
someplace that you've never known before.
The last person you thought to ask. You know, you assume nobody cares, and suddenly somebody stands up and says, "I do." And it's like, oh, well, this isn't what I figured out.
Well, I am very proud to say that in 20 years I never lost anybody. Yeah, that was.
It's so commendable. Goodness, I wish I could say the same. When I was in graduate school getting my master's degree, actually, a trans woman friend called up and explained how she was coming to the end of her financial resources. And she said point blank, "I am not prepared to be a homeless person." And I said, "Well, you can sleep on my couch, but I don't really have, an extra bedroom or anything to offer you. But, if you want to live here, you'll have a shower, a telephone, etc., and a mailing address." But she had built her entire world into this little apartment. And so I didn't know what else to say after we got off the phone conversation. And so I tried talking to my professors at the theological school. And they listened, but to my absolute amazement, nobody did anything. There was no active response. Well, I know a safe house. I know some place where she can live. I know somebody who needs a living housekeeper, whatever, something. There was nothing. And
What was the result?
well, a month later, I tried calling her to check on her, and the answer machine message had changed, and I just knew immediately this is not good. I called another trans woman friend, and she said no, she did not want to go with me. She didn't want any part of it. And I called whoever I could. Nobody wanted to deal with this, and I said, well, I have to. I don't have the luxury of ignoring this. And so I went over there, and I basically beat on the manager's door and said, no, you have to check on this now. And basically, it was the maintenance man and I that found the body. And then, but nobody else wanted any part of it, and so they all disappeared into the woodwork again and left me standing in the hallway to wait for the police officers and everyone else to arrive. And then to follow up on that, and I do consider it an honor and a privilege that my friend's sister agreed that I should be the minister to facilitate the memorial service. And it was an honor for me to do that. To me, it was just that the world had been robbed of an incredibly gifted artist. She was a very intelligent woman and very creative. And the basic reason for it, as far as I could tell, was that there was no place left in the world for her to be. I don't think anybody should ever have to face that. Of being the one that the world doesn't want. We need to be there for each other, or what legitimate claim do we have to being a compassionate human being?
You're right.
In any case, I don't mean to take up all our time on that because we never have enough time to discuss these topics
No.
adequately, but additional possibilities for suicide. It's a whole nother category that I don't have the medical expertise to get into, but there are a certain number of people who do in fact have chemical imbalances in their brains that
Yes.
need to be carefully monitored and, as necessary, moderated by a competent, trained physician.
And a perfect example of that, Abraham Lincoln
Abraham Lincoln.
was born with depression. In his 20s, his friends had to sleep in the same room with him to keep him on suicide watch.
Really?
And then it was rather an unfortunate marriage, it seemed, because she had her own problems. But yeah,
They were
this is a
different
man
in
that was
so many
born
ways.
he was born with depression. And there are a lot of people out there that are born with depression.
It's a hereditary
and,
imbalance.
It's a hereditary imbalance.
Okay.
I also feel like I have a little more perspective on this because I've had my own suicide attempt.
Okay.
So I can plainly say to someone who's calling, I know how you feel. And I know how we can get you out of this. Yeah.
I've never attempted it, actually, but there have been a number of times where I knew I was suicidal.
Yes.
And so I feel like I can say, yes, I've looked down the throat of the beast, and I know when I'm in danger, and I know when I'm not. And so part of my ongoing struggle in life, if you will,
Yes.
is to maintain an environment in which I don't get into the danger zone. You know, that I find adequate community and adequate support. And
you're able to do that.
But it takes a lot of monitoring. But the thing that frustrates me the most is when the circumstances of life shove me in that direction. People, administrators, municipal authorities. My sense of home once was completely threatened. I essentially bought an old house that nobody wanted. It had been sitting empty for years. And I fixed it up to the level where it was adequate for me. It met my needs perfectly. It was everything I needed. The municipal authorities stepped in and said, "You're too weird. We don't like you. We're not going to give you permission to live in your own house because everything you've done here did not have a permit. So we're going to throw you out of your own house." And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you are giving me every reason to commit suicide. And it was only because, I think, because I'm generally too stubborn to quit, that I basically made the decision to walk away from my house and go somewhere else rather than make that choice. But it would take way too long to describe all of the problems I encountered because of that. Because I had to give up all the resources that having a home included. Mm-hmm. You know, much as people in domestic violence situations, if they have to walk away, they are giving up food, clothing, shelter, etc. Society needs to be there to say, grab my hand. You don't need to make the final solution or the final choice. Grab my hand,
Well,
we will
that's
pull you
where
through
that
this.
911 was one of those ways.
And you knew of resources you could connect them with.
Definitely.
So it's like, you don't have to do this because you could do this. And I don't know if they ever said it, but a logical response would be, oh, I never thought of that. Or I didn't know that such an organization existed.
They did. They did say that, yeah.
You know,
And how would you know that?
And how would you know, until you're in that place of need, you don't always know what resources are out there. And hopefully in that moment they find someone like you who knows where the resources are and how to contact them and what to expect when you get there. And you know, you don't need to have this, you don't need to have that, you just need to show up. You know, and a lot of that I guess when it comes to dealing with suicide is being willing to show up for the struggle. But like my trans woman friend, believing in your ability to manage the struggle when you get there.
Now, one of the things
You understand what I mean by that?
I do. One of the things that you can do if you have a friend that's saying to you, I'm feeling suicidal. This may seem counterintuitive, however, you need to ask them, have you thought of a method? Not that I want you to think of a method, but if you have gone that far to think of a method, you're serious.
Sometimes. The only reason I say sometimes is because there have been times where it became a total digression away from what I was feeling to talk analytically about methods of suicide. And it's like, well, if you do this, then that will happen. Well, that wouldn't work. But, you know,
Talking with yourself about that?
talking with myself or talking with someone else. And by the times we deconstructed the methods, we basically said, oh, it'd never work anyway, and it would just make everything worse. And so it had become, it was a dialogue. By having the dialogue, I was subconsciously reminded that somebody cared enough about me to have that conversation with me. And so I was no longer alone facing it. There was now another person who was discussing, you know, granted it was a weird topic of conversation, but they weren't freaking out. They were just being very analytical and calm. And well, now I've got a person who cares about me, and we're doing problem solving. And it seems like an odd problem to address. But the fact that we were doing problem solving, regardless of the topic, made me feel empowered. And the more empowered I felt, the less I wanted to go through with something, with a response to feeling radically disempowered.
Yes.
I mean, another idea I put in one of my monthly newsletters was, because I know me, if I said I was feeling suicidal, someone could say, well, if you're going to call an end to it, let's go take one last hike for good time's sake. And anybody who knows me knows by the time I get up to the summit and come down again, I'm not going to feel depressed anymore. It will have totally sidetracked me from what I was thinking about doing. But that's knowing me. And
I don't want to say that medications are good for everyone and not good for... I won't take either side of that, because there's some people that without the medications would live a very miserable life. They are good for some people. They're not good for everybody.
In my case, I would respond very badly to someone saying, here, let me give you a pill or let me give you a drug. Because I want to be in my own mind. I want my self-agency. I want to be able to make my choices. But I have no objection to having that dialogue with a competent physician.
If your own mind is suicidal, is that what you...
I guess in my understanding, which, you know, granted we've just said there are some people who are clinically depressed by heredity.
Right.
From my experience, my perspective, I guess, I don't think the mind is what becomes suicidal. I don't think it's in the mind. I think it's in the circumstances, in the perception. It's not in here. It's right here in front of my eyes. It's not that the mind wants it to end. It's that the mind needs to see a way to meet its needs. If someone were to come in and I were to say, I'm overwhelmed, this is what's bearing down on me, and they say, oh, let me solve that for you. Well, suddenly the challenge is gone. It's not that the mind wanted to commit suicide, it's that the mind wanted the challenge resolved. And the challenge may be a feeling of radical disempowerment. There's nothing I can do, there's nowhere I can go, there's no way to make it stop. And it says, well, let me answer that one for you. And you suddenly lay out an option. And it's like, oh, well then I don't have to think about suicide because the problem isn't there anymore.
Right. They've handed it over to me, and I know what to do with it.
Yeah, but it doesn't automatically mean, here, let me give you a shot first, you know, of whatever antidepressant or whatever. It means listening long enough to know, is this hereditary? Is it circumstantial? Is it perceptual? If it's hereditary or if it seems like it's an actual mental thing, that's where somehow you want to get a doctor involved in the conversation.
Definitely.
Because there may be a temporary use of antidepressants that allows things to be processed. I have a bit of a distrust for the medical system, though, because
I can tell.
because even when I went in for an eye exam or something, the eye doctor, I mean, he was basically looking at a swelling on my eyelid, and the doctor, I felt sorry for him. I wanted to hug him or something. It was almost funny. He was so frustrated at the end, he couldn't think of what to write a prescription for. And it's like, no, I don't have to have a prescription. It's okay. You examined my eyes, you told me what it was, you've done your job, it's okay. And he's a medical doctor, and he's sitting there acting so frustrated that he can't write me a prescription. It was almost funny. But in that similar sort of way, I'm leery of doctors who want to whip out the prescription pad first. But if a doctor has done some kind of examination, conversationally, physically, whatever, can we try an MRI to be sure that everything with your brain is okay? MRI is that the one that...
That's a pretty expensive diagnosis, but...
Well, it's an expensive diagnosis because of the way our medical system is set up. But if that's what's going to tell you what's going on in the brain, as a society, we need to give doctors the ability to make effective diagnoses.
I think what they're probably going to do first is try an antidepressant and see if that makes any difference before they go for the more expensive testing.
And I'm guessing most people would be open to that. I would respond badly to it.
Yeah.
But if the doctor is willing to genuinely listen to me, and perhaps in concert with a 911 operator is willing to connect me to resources to deal with the challenges that are overwhelming me.
And if you get a doctor that you're not communicating with, get another doctor.
Which opens up a whole nother, I don't want to say can of worms, but how does one talk to a medical system? Because of late, when I've tried to do that, I keep running into this assumption that one doctor is as good as another. And
On whose part?
The
system.
The system telling me, just pick a doctor. One doctor is as good as another.
Oh, I disagree.
I disagree too, which is why we didn't get very far. But in any case, we're almost out of time, and
Yes.
so we need to quick race to our summary statements about dealing with suicide. To me, it's a place of radical disempowerment, but it could come from heredity, drugs, circumstances, loss of self-agency. I mean, the last thing I want to do is exclude the person from deciding what's going to happen to their life. But if there is a hereditary thing going on, I need to somehow coax them into a conversation with a doctor who can diagnose that.
So many times what's happened, the incident that's happened is they got dumped.
It's an emotional turmoil that is so overwhelming.
It's a terrible thing. It
Getting
it
dumped,
hurts your heart, and
the death of a loved one,
Yes.
the movie Ordinary People,
Yes.
the younger brother witnessing the drowning death of his older brother,
right.
and blaming himself and blaming himself and blaming himself.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, a competent psychologist was able to help him work through it.
Yes.
And some things take time and perseverance. But that's why it's so important to be there for each other and through those times. Not that you have to have the answers, you simply need to be present, and you need to show that you care.
Couldn't hurt.
Any final comments you'd like to make as we wind up our show?
If you really, really are passionate about suicide and you want to help, find a way to help. Maybe it's just one person, maybe it's an
You mean the
organization.
person who is not suicidal?
Right. If you want to help, if you want to be part of the solution, maybe you've had something happen in your life where a loved one committed suicide.
There's crisis
can
lines
help.
that are always
You
looking
can
for
help.
volunteers.
Yep.
Thank you very much for having this grandly difficult conversation, but it's something that really needs to be talked about a lot more.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you for watching.